Just put the Natalie on the.
He sent it. She sent it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Geraldine. Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, we're recording. So here we go. What? Okay, so here goes. We are on page 3B3. 3. Just to review where we got to from there, we have a discussion, another one of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi's teachings. And Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is teaching that we have a distinction that we made already about when the Megillah is read on the 14th at night and when it's read on the 15th. We usually read it on the 14th, and not usually, that's when we read it. But in walled cities that were ancient cities from the time of Joshua, then the Megillah is read on the following day, not on the day that everybody else reads the Megillah. So in Israel, to this very day, in Tel Aviv, they read it the same day as we read it in the rest of the world. But in Jerusalem is a walled city from the time of Joshua, and it's read on the following day. So we talked about that before. So now what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says is that there's a kind of area. We talk about the metropolitan area. So the area around certain around cities gets to be included in the city. So if you have a walled city, says Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, so the walled city from the time of Joshua, we mean, is going to read on its own special day, the next day after Purim for the rest of us on the 15th. And he says that includes also the surrounding area of that's outside the walls. And we've had a number of criteria about what that means. So first of all, he says if they're nearby. So we had already a discussion about what nearby means. Nearby is within an 18-minute walk of the city walls. So the whole periphery of the city that's around is considered part of the city, even though it's not inside the walls themselves. Then he says there's also near and that means if you can see the city, if you are sort of like under the city's general view, then you are also considered to be part of the city's practice. So then we had the question, what does it mean to be near but not seen, or seen but not near? What are these two criteria? How do they work with each other? That was at the end of 3b2. So the Talmud says that on a clear day, like they say, on a clear day you can see forever. So if you can see another town, a little hamlet out there someplace, but it's further than the 18-minute walk, as long as you can see it, then that hamlet and they can see the city, then that hamlet is considered part of the environs of the city, and it follows the practice of the city. So then they said, well, what do we need the near for? I mean, isn't anything near the city going to see the city? So what do we need the near? Why don't we just say anything that you can see? What do we need that extra criterion for? So the answer is that there are times when it'll be near, but you won't be able to see it. That's at the very top of 3b3. Right? So the answer, Gemara answers, Rabbi Yirmiyah said, such a case could occur when the town, the little hamlet, is situated in a valley. So it's tucked away someplace. So it may be actually very close by to the city, but nobody can see it. Because if something is going on, somebody needs to mute themselves, please. Natalie, can you mute yourself, please? Geraldine, can you mute yourself, please? Thank you. So that's the answer that we've got to so far. So therefore, we need these different kinds of criteria. Either it's close by, even if you can't see it, or even if it's not close by, but you can see it, then it all follows under the practice of that city. Just to think about it just for a half a second. Some people, live in certain parts of Montclair where they can see Manhattan. How does that affect their sense of place? Do they feel that they're part of Manhattan?
Well, some people might. Some people might see that as connecting them to the city. Other people might see that and think, oh, gee, here in Montclair, it's so small. So I think that people could, no, seriously, I think people could react that this is an inclusion kind of thing. I'm part of everything I can see. Other people do a comparison kind of thing and think, gee, we're really on the outskirts of something. We're not at the center. So I think that there's different ways people react.
Right.
I think that's.
Go ahead, Jen.
I mean, you can see the city from most of my towns. And I think, though, that really depends on your relationship with the city, whether you work there, whether you go in a lot. There are some of us who are like, yes, we completely identify practically as New Yorkers. And there's others who's like, it's a totally different world that they never venture into. And doesn't matter that they can see the skyline from their windows.
Right.
Then I remember how surprised I was when I found out that there were actually people who live, within, say, a 30 or 45-minute radius who have never, ever gone to New York, right? That they just don't even see. That to them, it's like so far away, and they just don't see.
Because they're paying New York City taxes. If you don't care about the city, go to Kansas.
Why didn't the Talmud say that? If you pay the taxes of the town, then you're part of the town. But if you don't pay the taxes,
if your taxes are influenced by that big city, then you are part of that big city. Yes.
Right, Sylvia. I can't hear you. You have to I can't hear you. It says that you're unmuted, but I cannot hear you. No. Figure it out. I don't know what's going on. Maybe now you're muted, but maybe your mic on your computer is off. You have to put the volume up on your computer. Still can't hear you. All right, you'll figure it out. I'm just bringing it up because I'm saying there are certain communities that are considered sort of bedroom communities of a city. Montclair is a little bit, but not quite. We have enough of a sense of ourselves that we wouldn't want to be considered just a auxiliary of Manhattan, unless it's no, you don't present, Sylvia. Do not present. No, take off the presenting. So how people actually see their relationship to the big city, can vary in many different ways. I'm just pointing it out because what the Talmud is trying to do is create some kind of objective criterion, but it's not necessarily the one that works in our own experience. One of the things that occurs to me, it is of course partly a question of scale. We can see Manhattan because look at all those gigantic tall buildings. If Manhattan, was a city that was built much flatter, then how much of a sense of connection or whatever link would there be? I don't know. And also just, of course, the kind of feudal relationship that is closer to the reality of the Talmud is not quite what we're involved in. So there's a different sense of life happening in our world. Stuart. Yeah.
This is not an entirely frivolous point. Somewhat frivolous.
But it's partly frivolous.
Partly. Well, the example I'm going to give is a little bit frivolous. But the text says that if the town is situated on top of a mountain, but the case of an open town that is near a walled city, even though it cannot be seen from it. So it's suggesting that the perspective is from the city to the suburbs. So we in Montclair, we're at a higher elevation, we can, in some parts of the town, we can see the city. Some parts of New York, you would never be able to see Montclair from the city. So it depends on which is the perspective. The frivolous part of the observation is my wife has some relatives who at one point lived in a big city, and my family lived outside the big city. And whenever we would say we wanted to get together with them, we would say, come out and see us. We're not that far. It's an hour's drive. And they would say, oh, it's 3 hours to get in. If we're coming out to see you, it takes 3 hours. But if you come in to see us, it takes an hour. So there's, obviously that's a matter of perspective. If you live in New York City, coming out to New Jersey seems like a real schlep, whereas we go into the city all the time. So I don't know. It seems like the perspective here is from the perspective of the city itself.
Mm-hmm. Good.
I don't know.
And even in the metropolitan New York, there are people in Queens and Brooklyn and Staten Island that have never been to Manhattan. So so I don't know about the Bronx,
right?
But it's notorious.
We know Eastsiders who really never been to the West Side.
Right. So we're living in a much more complicated kind of way than back then. But there they were trying to lay down a certain kind of simple rule of thumb, and that's what they did. Okay, now we have another statement by Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi about another possible variation with regard to this distinction between walled cities and open cities. So now we're at 3b3, the top of the left-hand column after the first 3 lines. Can somebody unmute themselves and read it out loud for us, please? Oh, Sylvia, what happened to Sylvia? Now she left the meeting. I missed her. Sorry. Maybe she's coming back in. I hope. Okay. Can somebody read the text? It starts another teaching from Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi also said. Anybody reading that? Going once.
I can read it.
Thank you.
Okay, so except that, here on the top. Another teaching from Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, a city that was initially settled, that is, houses were built, and then was surrounded by a wall at a later date, is treated as a village, that is, an unwalled city. What is the reason for this ruling? For it is written, if a man shall sell a residence house in a walled city, which implies that the city was first surrounded with a wall and then settled, and not first settled and then surrounded with a wall.
Okay, so we'll stop for a half a second. Sylvia, you're back. Good to see you. Did you figure out how to do it? Now you're muted. I still can't hear you. Cannot hear you. Sorry. I don't know what it is. Yeah, Lynn, you were raising your hand? What did you want to say? No. Okay. All right. So we'll just have to keep on moving. So, okay. So what is Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi putting out now as a new distinction? He says we have a distinction between walled cities and non-walled cities. So now he says it also depends on when the walls got put up. A walled city does not qualify as a walled city unless it was planned as a walled city from the beginning. It has to be something where the walls were part of the initial establishment of the city. And not, well, there was this kind of village, and then it started growing, and it became more important, and then they decided to put a wall around it. If the wall is subsequent to the development of the city, of this urban cluster, then it's not considered a walled city. It has to have been something where the walls come into play from the start. And he takes this from a verse that he reads, if a man shall sell a resident house in a walled city. Ki imkor beit moshav ir choma. So the reading that he does of that verse is to say that the definition of the city is that it is a walled city, that it was meant to be a walled city from the very beginning. There's a long footnote, number 31. And here we get into a disagreement about what is the basic thrust of this statement. What's the context of his statement? So the verse that he quotes has nothing to do with Purim. It has nothing to do with the Megillah. It has to do with a different rule. There's a rule, we'll be coming up to it. In the topic is related to the question of the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year. So in the Jubilee year, everything goes back to its original family ownership, right? When the land of Israel was entered by the people of Israel, they each got their own piece of land. Each tribe got their piece of land, and then they divided up into each family. So there's an estate. There's theoretically a family estate that belongs to each of us in the land of Israel. And the original picture of the Torah is that whatever gets sold and passed down, or whatever happens, it gets divided up. Maybe the family needs to make some money, so they sell a field. But after 50 years, in the 50th year, everything reverts back to its original owner. So then the Torah says, what about if you don't live on the land? What happens if you live in a city? What's the deal then? So the rule has a wrinkle in it about when you have an apartment. You have an apartment in town. You don't live on the farm. What's the story then? So let's look at note 31.
Okay, I had to unmute.
Right.
According to Rashi, this rule was stated in reference to the laws governing the sale of houses detailed in Leviticus. The Torah permits the seller of a house to buy the house back, redeem, from the purchaser, even against the will of the purchaser. In regard to a house situated in an unwalled city, the seller has this right at any time after the original sale. However, houses in cities that were walled in the days of Joshua may be redeemed only during the first year after the sale. Okay. If Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi informs us here that a city that was first settled and then walled at a later date has the status of an unwalled city and whose houses may be redeemed at any time. However, in regard to Megillah reading, it makes no difference whether the city was first walled or settled.
Okay. So wait. So time out. So first, let's understand. So the text that he's quoting, the verse that he's quoting, is, as I said, in another week and a half, 2 weeks, we're going to be reading it about the Jubilee year. And the Torah says there's an exception. All of this business about returning things, that's within the agricultural context that applied to most of the people. But if you're talking about city life, then the Jubilee year is irrelevant, right? The Torah says if you're talking about selling fields, then when you sell a field, you have to calculate how many years it is until the Shemitah, until the Jubilee, and so on and so forth. And you can't overcharge and so on. But when it comes to apartments in a city, and that means houses too, but any urban dwellings are exempted from that whole set of rules, and they have their own independent set of rules. So the first part of it is that if you have a house in a city and you sell it, you always have the right, if it's a regular old open city, you always have the right to say, I want it back. You have to pay for it, but you always have the right to buy it back. So that's in an open city. But in a walled city, says the Torah, then you only have that right within the first year. But once that first year has elapsed, since you sold your house, you no longer have a right to demand that the sellers sell it back to you. You can offer and you can buy it if he wants, but you don't have the right to demand it. So that applies to a walled city. So here, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is quoting that verse and saying, where does this rule apply? It applies to a walled city that was walled from the get-go. But if it was an open city that later on became a walled city, then the original rule about the rights of the buyers and the sellers applies to that place. And the fact that a wall comes in afterwards doesn't change the original rule. That seems to be Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi's teaching based on that verse. This is the way Rashi reads it. So the question is, what is this? And therefore, and that means, and as Rashi then continues to explain, and it has nothing to do with Megillah. In Megillah, we don't make this distinction, right? In the question of buying and selling the right to buy and sell the apartment or the house, that's a question of establishing what the original rule was, and then we don't change it. So that's the logic of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi's reading of the verse. But that has nothing to do with the Megillah criterion. The Megillah criterion is if a wall was put up by the time of Joshua, what do we care if there was a small village there first? As long as the wall is as ancient as the time of Joshua, what do we care what the original intent was of establishing that town? If there's a wall from ancient times, then that walled city is just like Shushan, and it should be a city that we should read the Megillah like Shushan. So that's Rashi's reading. There's a difficulty textually with adopting Rashi's reading, and that is, what is this text doing here? We're in the middle of talking about Megillah. We had Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi talking about the walled cities and the open cities with regard to what about their environs, what about the peripheries around them. That's about Megillah reading. The next teaching that we're going to have from him is about Megillah reading. So other people are not happy with Rashi's interpretation, and they say, no, this is not just a string of arbitrary teachings that are by Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, and in the middle of it, they threw in one that has nothing to do with Megillah. That's Rashi's understanding. They're all authored by Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. So we have a little pamphlet. Here are different teachings that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi gave about cities. One of them is about Megillah. One of them is not about Megillah. The next one is about Megillah. That's the way Rashi sees it. But other people say, no, there's a much more cohesive organization to this group of teachings. And therefore, they insist that even though the verse is from a law that has nothing to do with Megillah, it's just a proof text, but actually what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is saying is that this applies to the reading of Megillah. So we have a basic conflict, a basic disagreement. Is this distinction relevant to what date you read Megillah or not? Rashi says it's irrelevant to the reading of the Megillah. A walled city is a walled city is a walled city. And if it was a walled city from the time of Joshua, you read Megillah on the 15th. And it doesn't matter when the walled city got up there, as long as it made it by the deadline of Joshua. According to now we're going to go into the next paragraph, other Rishonim say differently. So Sarita, if you could just read the rest of that paragraph.
Under 31. Other Rishonim understand that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi does in fact refer to the laws of Megillah reading. He informs us that a city that was first settled and then walled is treated as an unwalled city and reads the Megillah on the 14th.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, and this is referred to more than once. Okay, right. So that's what we need to understand, is that how we actually read this text, what is the thrust of what he's saying, is up to this argument. It's not clear how we contextualize what he is saying, and it makes a difference in understanding the law from his point of view. Right? Okay. Yes, somebody wanted to say something?
Yeah. I am. So one, I got where he was coming, that this whole discussion was about when you read the Megillah, and so that's why what seems to be a digression is in there. It's not a digression, because that's knowing what date you do something is important. My comment is totally unrelated to Megillah. It's this issue about this distinction between the walled and the unwalled city, and how that affects what transactions between individuals, and the uncertainty of living then in an unwalled city. If you buy a house and yet the person you bought it from can come back at any time and claim it. I'm just sort of thinking about that sort of eminent domain issue and what that would mean for people who live in that kind of environment. And I guess that's off the topic of Megillah reading, but it just really hit me. Yeah.
It's a very stark legal support for a reality that seems to have been perceived, which is that kind of urban living is basically shiftless. It's basically very fluid. So people buy it and then they they have to sell because they get into trouble or whatever it is, and then they want to buy it back, and then they're allowed to buy it back. I mean, we're always, as I said, we're always talking about you have to pay market value. So if the price of the house goes up, then you have to pay whatever the price of the house is, but you have the right to buy it and to dispossess that person who doesn't want to leave. So yeah, it's a very striking law that creates a very tough kind of environment in the city. It's an interesting, intriguing question that maybe we can talk about some more during our Torah study next week.
Rabbi?
Yes, Josie.
It sort of reflects on this difference between the agrarian society as rooted and consistent and dependable, and the urban is kind of shifting and you never know where you stand.
Right. Although there's a little bit of a paradox, because what's the ground zero, to use a terrible term? What's the starting point for this?
The time of Joshua?
With the urban dweller.
Right, the urban dweller that it was designed for urban living, right? It was designed to be walled. So that's actually a small enclosed space that gets more and more and more and more crowded over time. That's more stable. So in fact, it's just that urban environment that is more stable. And outside of that, anything that's unwalled is less stable, because the person who you bought a house from can come back and reclaim. So I think
the instability applies to somebody, but there's a certain stability to the other side. The person who can constantly reclaim that they want to rebuy their house, they know that they can, if they get the money together, they can always go back and get their house.
Yeah.
So there's a certain stability on that side. So it works in contradictory ways, and it's not clear what the reality is that the Torah is either coming to terms with or trying to create. Is the Torah trying to establish some kind of system here, or is the Torah simply acknowledging that that's the way things are, and just trying to legislate it? So as I said, if there's interest, we can try to talk about that next week when it's part of the Torah portion. Okay, here we go. Next teaching. Sarita, you're up.
Unmute. Another teaching from Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi also said, a city that does not have 10 unoccupied men who are constantly in the synagogue is treated as a village.
Okay, so this is the word.
Unoccupied, like they nothing to do?
Right.
Okay.
So, right. So the word in Hebrew is batlanim. Batlanim means people that are just sort of like wasting their time. Right. So we say, for instance, right before Pesach, we want to get rid of all our chametz. Right. So we have we go running around. We look for the chametz. We try to find it. We either we burn it, we throw it out, we eat it, we sell it. So we get rid of the chametz, and then we say, well, what if I missed a piece of chametz someplace? What if I didn't find it? What if I forgot about a particular cupboard that's someplace? So that then we say leheve batel umavutal ke'afra de'ara. Let it be nullified. Let it be canceled. like dust. So what we're saying is, in that case, this is called bitul. Bitul means nullification, canceling. It's nothing. It's worthless. It has no meaning to me, and I'm relinquishing my ownership of it. And it's not my chametz anymore, and therefore I'm not liable for it. So here the verse is the word, and it's also used, for instance, when people waste time. When people waste time, it's called bitul zman. You're wasting your time. The word zman is time. And wasting time is you're taking time. It's a gift. It's a precious gift. Instead of making it, valuable and meaningful, you're just throwing it away. And then you have a term, bitul Torah. You're wasting precious opportunities to study Torah. Instead of studying Torah, you're watching television or something like that.
Which we all do.
So in the yeshiva world, when I was growing up in that, like that was a big issue, right? When are you making use of your time properly, and when are you not making use of your time properly? So that's the word batel. Batel means unused, and then it has connotations of having no worth and so on. So here we have this word that's used here in a very ironic way.
Yeah.
Because what it's saying is, do we have 10 people who have nothing else to do, and therefore they are, and here's where we get different interpretations, and therefore they're available. So the point is they're available for communal needs. So what are those communal needs? So different interpretations are mentioned. If you see number 33, note number 33.
The men who remain unemployed and are always in the synagogue every morning and evening, the times of prayer. This practice is based on the following passage from Tractate. Okay, when the Holy One, blessed be He, enters a synagogue and does not find 10 men in it, he immediately becomes angry.
Okay, so this is one way of understanding this. The people have nothing else to do. They're unemployed, and therefore they are hanging out in the synagogue. So does that mean that they're wasting their time? This is part of the sociological realia of different Jewish communities in different places. We know that there is something called a yeshiva, right? An academy of Jewish learning. But in the old days, before the 19th century, when yeshivas became really, really powerhouses as institutions, yeshivas were very small and dispersed and very localized. And in general, what people were doing, if they weren't working, if they were studying, which meant, let's say, if you were a young kid, you were studying still, or if you were able to study, you went to the synagogue and you sat in one of the benches there, and they had stenders, they had little lecterns, and you took a book and you studied it, and you spent your day there. And whether or not you actually actively, productively studied was really your business. So there was people there that really studied and became the great rabbis of the generation, and there were people there that hung out and basically stayed by the stove. Hopefully, the stove was still warm. It was a little bit, in that respect, to use a maybe a kind of a shocking image. It was the subway. It was the subway system of the Jewish community, where homeless people or people who were very poor, people who needed a roof over their heads, could come. So they were not necessarily the elite of the town. On the other hand, when it was time for mincha, then we knew that Shmerel and Beryl and Cheryl were there. So we didn't have to worry about calling people in from the marketplace to make the minyan. So there was an upside to that. So that's one way to think about it. As people who are just with nothing other pressing for them to do, they're hanging out in the synagogue, and therefore they are able to make a minyan. Now, if we just go with that interpretation for a minute, let's now see what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is saying. What Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is saying is a city that does not have these 10 people is treated as a village. Right? So he's making a pretty strong statement that you're going to have a population, let's say, and of course, the numbers that we have today were never, anything close like that in Jewish communities in the past. But let's say you had 100 people, which was a decent Jewish community. You had 100 people, but you didn't have a guaranteed minyan, then you're not a city. The definition of a city is not the numbers, it's not the population numbers, and it's not the wall, apparently, although that's part of what we're going to now see is up for discussion. But what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi adds now is a whole different standard. The standard is, you want to be considered a Jewish community, you have to have a guaranteed minyan. So I'm not going to say anything about Shomrei, but this is a traditional, value and a traditional issue. When you look in Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law that was written in the 16th century, it says that this is one of the first things that Jews, if they move into a particular area, one of the first things that they have to establish, right? They have to have a mikveh, and they have to have a place where they can all collectively come to daven. So, in the old days, this was what defined a Jewish community as opposed to a community that wasn't necessarily too Jewish. Yeah, Stuart.
Yeah, just a quick question. So I thought that originally the definition of, at least with respect to the Megillah, of when it was going to be read was based on whether it was walled at the time of Joshua, right? But then it seems like that status can be lost. It can't be gained. But if the city loses population, then it's no longer counts. Or are we talking here just about the transfer of real property?
No.
So they're two different.
This standard that he's adding now is not a standard about property at all. It's a standard about involvement. If the city sustains, a group of people that the community supports for the sake of having a minyan,
right?
That's a real official community that is called a community for the purposes of reading Megillah. We're going to look at note 34 in a second, but this is which city this applies to is a question. But whichever city it applies to, all the other criteria can be met.
Right. Physical criteria. If it's not a city, then it's not a city.
No. But if it loses that minyan,
right,
then you're right. You can't. You lose it.
Doesn't matter whether it has a wall or not. If it's...
Well, that's what we're going to now read in 34. But correct. It's so the other physical objective standards of locale and walls and so on and so forth are still, according to this new teaching, subject to another sociological, spiritual standard.
So can I have again? Perhaps this is again off the topic of the Megillah, but I'm reacting to this statement here about the guaranteed minyan is by people who are sort of unemployed, maybe, but it gives you a sense of the different value, if you were, that people contribute to the community, to the synagogue. And so, there are people who can contribute a lot of money, but then there are also people who might not be able to do that, but who can be there and can give their time. Right. And it makes me think about the fact that when we put in our current model, the self-sustaining share model, it was actually supposed to involve both a monetary contribution and a time volunteer contribution, and we kind of haven't really thought about that in a while, and really articulated what does that mean. So I just think that this raises that whole issue about
Right. Well,
what brings value to a community. Yeah.
right. Well said. Well, I think we think about it, but we just recognize the reality of how much we can try to do it and not. We keep bringing up the volunteer component. You're right. And this is, of course, one of the standard pieces of wisdom about board members, right? That different board members contribute different kinds of things, and some board members are important to be on a board because they just have the big bucks. But other board members have an expertise, and then other board members have dedication, right? So these are different ways to contribute, and what this is saying, according to this interpretation. Actually, before we go to 34, I want to read I want to explain a different interpretation. Is saying, yeah, that if we can count on these people to make the minyan, that's a real contribution to our society. It's a real contribution to our community. There is a different approach to to reading these 10 people, who these 10 people are, and according to another interpretation, these 10 people are actually functionaries of the town who administer town requirements, the things that the town needs. So according to this, the 10 people are 3 judges, right? 3 rabbinic judges. You need 3 people to be a court, to be a local court, to adjudicate issues in the Jewish community. And then you have 2 collectors of charity. So the rule is that you can't entrust collecting charity to only one person. There needs to be 2 people so that neither one of them can take advantage of the trust of the community and embezzle the money themselves. So you always need 2 collectors of charity. And then the giving out of the charity has to have a 3rd person, because it becomes almost like a court thing as well, but it has nothing to do with how much knowledge you have of Jewish law, but it's a responsibility that is a serious responsibility. So that makes us add another person. So far now we have 6, right? Then you have to have a scribe, and you have a court officer, somebody who administers all of the issues of the court, and 1 shamish, 1 gabbai, 1 person who takes care of the shul, right? And 1 teacher for the children. So that ends up being 10 people. So according to that interpretation, the 10 people that are being mentioned here are not just happenstance people that happen to be, it just so happens that we've got in our community, we can always be sure that there's a minyan, because they have nothing else to do. These people actually are employed, but they're called batlanim, they're called unemployed because they're employed to do the things that they're doing so that they don't do something else. This is one of the big discussions about whether rabbis can be paid a salary. So according to the official principle, Moses didn't get paid a salary. When Moses gives his farewell speech to the children of Israel, he says, "I never took a penny from any of you." So the Talmud says, just as Moses, this goes back to our study earlier this morning, Moses is our first rabbi, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher, and just as Moses did it for nothing, all rabbis should do it for nothing. So Maimonides, for instance, was very dedicated to that principle, and as a result, he worked himself to death because he ended up being a physician. He was a physician to Saladin, and that's how he supported himself. And he didn't take a salary as the rabbi of the Jewish community in Egypt, which he was the official rabbi, the chief rabbi of Egypt. So he said, I can never take payment for Torah. Torah has to be open and free for everybody. So, but that was not doable in reality in many communities. So then the scrambling was, well, so how do we honor that principle, but at the same time make sure that our rabbis don't starve to death? So the answer was that the salary that a rabbi gets is payment so that the rabbi doesn't do something else. So, and that's called schar batala. It's the reward for not taking a job, right? We're paying you to be our rabbi because you could have become an attorney. You could have become a hedge fund operator. You could have become, God knows what. And you could have made zillions of dollars. We want to pay you something so that you refrain from doing all of that, so that you'll be available to be our rabbi. So that's the way that the tradition got around this idea. So that's what this other interpretation is saying. What we're talking about when we say batlanim, the people who are not employed, it doesn't mean that they're just ne'er-do-wells. It means they're not taking other jobs that would take them away from helping the community. They're actually officials of the community. They're being paid by the community. They are part of our, administrative infrastructure as a community. And it ends up that the minimum is 10. So if a community doesn't have the wherewithal to have these 10 people be on their payroll, according to this interpretation, then that's not a solid community. That's not the big community. So that takes it very much away from what we were saying a minute ago about the spiritual value of having a minyan all the time in the synagogue, and it has it instead as a kind of a criterion of how organized the Jewish community really is, and whether it's able to sustain itself as a Jewish community. So these are two very different ideas. In between, or as a modification, certainly of the first idea, later on, people said, look, do you really have to have 10 people sitting around in the shul all day long, either studying or praying or not doing anything? So one of the medieval commentators says, look, in the land of Israel today, when they read the Megillah on Purim, and they read it on the 15th, then believe me, there aren't 10 people in the shul that are sitting around doing nothing. How do those places justify that they're reading the Megillah on the 15th? And his answer is, you don't have to have them physically present in the shul. It just means that we know that people will show up for a minyan. They are gainfully employed. They're not unemployed, and they're not actually even being paid to make a minyan. But if it's a community that has the certainty that when morning minyan is supposed to be held at 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning, we have a minyan. We never have to worry about a minyan. Then that's okay. Even if those people that are coming in to make the minyan have many other kinds of professions or ways to make a living. So we have here basically three kinds of explanations, two of them centering on the question of whether you can make a minyan, and one of them about the organization, the sophistication of the organization of the Jewish community per se. So now the question is, what do these criteria apply to? What kind of city? Number 34, footnote number 34.
The city that is discussed here cannot be a walled one, because any city with a wall has the legal status of a walled city and reads on the 15th, even if it lacks 10 unoccupied men. Rather, the Gemara refers to an unwalled city and teaches that if it lacks 10 unoccupied men, it has the status of a village and may advance their Megillah reading to the preceding day of assembly. Although in this tractate, the word
Krach,
it's a little tiny here, refers specifically to a walled city. This case is an exception to that rule.
Okay, so this first statement, this first paragraph is the approach of the Tosafot, and they're figuring out what the heck is going on here. This modification that if you don't have a minyan or you don't have the 10 paid functionaries, then you don't get considered a city. What kind of city are we talking about? Is it the walled city or the unwalled city? Well, if it's the walled city, then we understand it means which day are you going to read it on, the 14th or the 15th. The problem with that is that they don't get that, they don't think it's legitimate to say that we're adding another criterion where we can take away the status of a walled city just because you don't have 10 people. Right back to Stuart's point earlier. So they say a walled city is a walled city is a walled city. You read on the 15th no matter what. The question is, what about the other kinds of cities? So even though in terms of the text of the Gemara, it doesn't quite fit in, that's the word krach is used, and according to them, it shouldn't be used. But what they're saying is, no, we're talking about open cities, but again, back to our very, very first discussion that opened up the tractate, there are big cities that have markets, and then there are little cities or villages that don't have markets and where people have to come to the market and where people have to come to find somebody to read Megillah for them, right? So those smaller towns have to come to the big town, and therefore they can read on the 11th or the 12th or the 13th or the 14th of Adar, right? That was the leeway that was established at the very beginning of our tractate for the little towns to go to the big towns, and then they go where the big towns are going to have a minyan. So according to this, even if it's a big town that has a market on Monday and Thursday, if they don't have a minyan, then we're back to square one. That's the interpretation that this offers for what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is saying. So it's not talking about a walled city at all. It's talking about open cities. Hey, that would be a good name for a movie. And it means that if they don't have a minyan, then they're going to have to scramble, and we give them the different dates, figure out how you can finally get your Megillah reading done, whether it's on the 11th or the 12th or the 13th, depending on when you can go to the other city where it has a minyan, and it'll be okay. So that's Tosafot. Yes.
So in order to read Megillah, that is one of the things that requires a minyan?
No.
It doesn't.
No, it doesn't require a minyan, but what it does require is somebody who knows how to read Megillah. So
Right,
what we had at the beginning of this discussion, which was already a few months ago, was that there were certain communities that were at a loss. They didn't have enough people that knew what to do to be able to read Megillah for themselves. So they would have to travel to a big town in order to find somebody there who could read Megillah, and then they would do it on a market day. So the market day would end up being on the 11th or the 12th or the 13th, besides the 14th. The 14th is the day they really should be reading, right? But then they're going, oh no, but nobody can read Megillah for us. So what should we do? The answer is those outlying towns, those little villages, used to go to the big town. Even if it's an unwalled town, it was a bigger town where they could find somebody to read Megillah for them. This was the whole discussion at the beginning of our tractate. So now what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is understood to be saying is, if you go to one of those big towns and the big town doesn't have a minyan, then that big town also is considered a small town. And then you have to figure out when you can actually find somebody to read. And therefore you have now the leeway of either the 11th, the 12th, or the 13th, in addition to the 14th. So that leeway is built in even to the market city, the market town, if they don't have those features of a Jewish community. That's the way it's understood by Tosfot. However, not everybody agrees with that. Ramban, now we're back to the footnote.
Ramban, however, states that the Gemara does refer to a walled city. If a walled city lacks 10 unoccupied men, it has the status of a village. Its residents read on the 14th, or if they wish, they may advance their reading to the preceding day of assembly. Ritva and Ran agree with Ramban that the Gemara speaks of a walled city. However, in their view, the residents of such a city read the Megillah on the 15th, and the Gemara here teaches that if they wish, they may advance their reading to the preceding day of assembly.
Okay. So you have little wrinkles there of differences between the Ramban and the Ritva and the Ran, but they both disagree with Tosfot, and they say, no, we're really talking about modifying the law of the walled city. Just because the city has a wall, that doesn't continue to convey to it the status of a walled city to read on a particular day. Ramban is the most extreme. He says the walled city loses its status as a walled city, period. It has to read on the 14th. For the other commentators, they say, no, it reads on the 15th, but we have to be realistic. If it doesn't really have that kind of Jewish social capital, so to speak, or spiritual capital, then we're going to need to give them a dispensation. And if they have to, they're going to have to do it on some other day when they can bring somebody in to read Megillah. So that's the argument. So, okay.
Rabbi?
Yes.
So I just, this whole pragmatic thing is wonderful because here you're supposed to read it on a certain day, but there's the recognition that you might not be able to because you have to recruit somebody who's already booked to read on a different day. Does this also suggest that in terms of the people who are able to read Megillah, that they should sort of anticipate and see it as part of their responsibility to travel so that they can read Megillah elsewhere rather than everybody coming to them?
So that's not exactly the way the system is portrayed here. The way the system is portrayed is that the traveling is on the part of the villagers who need to hear Megillah. And what they do is they end up joining bigger communities that already have the Megillah reading established. So the principle that you're talking about is an interesting principle, but it's not an obligation on anybody to go become like a circuit Megillah reader, and go traveling around. Although that's definitely happens. People do that to this very day, and they go to read Megillah in certain places. Let's say a senior citizen home, or a hospital, or different kinds of smaller groups that benefit from that, and that's simply out of the goodness of and dedication of the person who's doing it. But it's not an obligation. The obligation is on that community to get going and get someplace where they will be able to hear the Megillah.
But isn't the whole point of being flexible with the date on which the Megillah can be read is so that you can have it in your own community?
No, what the flexibility is to say, since you are already going to the market on Monday and Thursday, so if that Monday or Thursday is not the day of Purim, we'll give you a pass, and you're going to go to the market anyway. So you're going to, in your business trip, you also will have to carve out time to listen to the Megillah. And some of this stuff we talked about, as I said, a few months back, and we should understand that this does not apply anymore. Now the requirement is the 14th or the 15th, period, and that's it. Okay, so now the Gemara asks a question. We're on 3b, middle of the left-hand column.
Right. The Gemara asks, what new point does Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi teach us? We have already learned his ruling in the following Mishnah, what is considered a large town, and in which there are 10 unoccupied men. If there are less than this number, it is considered a village.
Right. So that's a Mishnah that we'll get to in a couple of pages. So Gemara is simply asking, well, what are you adding? We have this in a Mishnah. So what's the additional point that you're making? Gemara answers.
The Gemara answers, it was necessary for Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi to discuss the case of a city as opposed to the Mishnah which discusses a town. He teaches us that even though many people visit the city from outside, and many of these visitors are unoccupied during their stay in the city, they are not included in the requisite number of 10 unoccupied men.
Okay, so that's where the difference is, which term is being used. In the Mishnah later on, the term is Ir, which means a town or a city. We use that now today to mean a city, but here it means a big town. And krach is the word that's used by Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. And krach is this word that causes trouble for Tosfot, because krach means a big metropolis, which is different than a big town. So the Mishnah is talking about that, And what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is saying is even that big metropolis, which is the magnet for where people come to, and you might think, okay, great. So that's actually going to solve our problem. Because if everybody's coming on market day to this big center, this big commercial center, then surely there'll be enough people to make a minyan. We don't have to worry about it. And his putting his foot down is saying, no, you can't worry. You can't depend on the kindness of strangers. You have to have your own self-generated community in order to be considered a big metropolis, right? Big, not in the sense of numbers, but big in the sense of significance and honor. So that's his extra point. His extra point is that this is about, I know that there are many people that are going to come into town because of the market day. They don't count. What do you have to show for yourself independent of all the visitors that are coming from outside? Okay, so that's the teaching. We have time for a little more. Another teaching.
Another teaching from Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi also said, a walled city that was destroyed and subsequently settled is treated as a walled city. The Gemara asks what is meant by destroyed. If you say it means that its walls were destroyed, then Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi's ruling teaches the following. If it was subsequently settled, that is, the walls were rebuilt, yes, it is afforded the status of a walled city. But if it was not settled, that is, the walls were not rebuilt, it is not afforded the status of a walled city. But it was taught in the Baraita to the contrary. The verse states that has not a wall. From this we derive that even though it does not have a wall at the present time, as long as it had one previously, that is during the days of Joshua son of Nun, it is regarded as a walled city. Question.
In other words, right. So this is the question of if the walls come tumbling down, does the walled city lose its status as a walled city? It had walls at the time of Joshua. But then what happens if they fall down? So if we read Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi in a certain way, he seems to be saying, as long as they had the walls at the beginning, if they fall down and then they get rebuilt, even though they're new walls, but they are a replacement for the original walls, and therefore we restore the original status. So we have here a fluid situation. You need the walls. If a walled city loses its walls, as long as the walls have tumbled down, it's not a walled city. But if we can rebuild the walls, if we restore the walls, then it becomes a walled city again. So it goes back and forth, according to this understanding. So now we have the extra braita, right? The external teaching of the sages that says that no, as long as it doesn't have a wall, right? As long as it had a wall, even if the walls tumble down, it's still a walled city, right? So what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi was saying, according to this understanding that we're proposing, is that when you lose the walls, at that moment, you lose your status. You can regain it by rebuilding it. But if you don't have the walls right now, it doesn't matter that you had the walls at the beginning. You're done. And this braita says, no. All we want to know is, did it have walls around it at the time of Joshua? Of course, over time, the walls could deteriorate, the walls could fall down, it could be conquered and destroyed. It doesn't matter. We're simply looking at a moment in time. Did it have walls at that time or not? If it did, we don't care what happens afterwards. So which is it? Do we freeze the status of the walled city according to its original state? Or does the status of the walled city change and fluctuate according to its present physical makeup? This is the question. So let's get the answer, and then we'll be able to conclude for today.
The Gemara explains Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi's statement. Rather, you must say, what is the meaning of destroyed? That it was destroyed of its 10 unoccupied men, that it no longer had such a group of men. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi teaches that if at some later date the city regains the presence of 10 unoccupied men, it returns to its original status.
So here we build from one teaching to the other teaching. And because we feel pushed into a certain interpretation based on another source, we have this Breita, which we can't argue with. The Breita says that you have a status of a walled city no matter what happens to the walls later. So when Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi is saying, no, there's a fluctuation, there's a fluidity, you could have it and then lose it and then get it back, what status is he talking about? The answer is, he's talking about that spiritual communal situation that he established earlier as a criterion. The walled city needs to have the 10 batlanim. The walled city needs to have those 10 people that exemplify the dedication of the community to serving God as a community with a minyan. And if it has it, it's a community. If it doesn't have it, it doesn't matter what the physical situation is. That's what Rabbi Shua ben Levi says. But what he says is, but that can be lost and can be regained. Right? We can lose that ability to hold a minyan together. But if we want to, we can try to get it back. And if we get it back, then it counts. We're back to our original status. So that's the way the Gemara now reinterprets his statement. Back to the distinction that we had before between the two commentators. Is this talking about a walled city or not? This would seem to be, as they say, as some of the commentators say, this should seem to weigh heavily in favor of reading Rabbi Shua ben Levi as always talking about a walled city. Right? When Tosfot said, no, a walled city is a walled city is a walled city. So why is Rabbi Shua ben Levi adding this criterion of a minyan or not? No, he must be talking about an unwalled city. But here we have, according to the simplest flow of the Gemara, we're applying this again explicitly to a walled city that lost its walls, but then also lost its minyan, but then got its minyan back. So it's a walled city, even though it lost its walls, but it's not a walled city if it loses its 10 minyan people, right? We don't care about losing the walls, but we do care about the minyan people. So I think that there's a definitely a stronger textual argument for Ramban and Ritva and the Ran against the Tosfot. Okay, we're going to stop here, and we have enough to think about for the next couple of weeks, but we'll meet, God willing, next week, and we'll be at the very end of 3b3, and as I said, I already sent you page 4, which is in another couple of lines, will be on page 4. Okay?
Thank you.
Care.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Yashar Koach.
Thank you, Yashar Koach.
To everybody.